people don't lose power because they feel emotions. They lose power because they reveal them before understanding who's watching. That sentence alone dismantles one of the most dangerous myths modern society teaches, that emotional openness is strength. You've been told that showing how you feel is brave, that transparency builds trust, that vulnerability earns respect. But that narrative ignores a fundamental truth about human psychology and power dynamics. Power is not built on how honest you are about your inner world. Power is built on how contained that inner world remains until disclosure is chosen, timed, and strategic. Society glorifies emotional exposure because it creates predictability. Predictable people are easier to manage, easier to influence, easier to position. When someone reveals their emotions openly and early, they are not demonstrating courage. They are providing data. And data is leverage. The moment another person knows what excites you, what scares you, what angers you, or what you crave, they gain a map of your nervous system. From that point forward, interaction is no longer neutral. It is asymmetrical. This is where the confusion between emotional truth and emotional leakage becomes dangerous. Emotional truth is internal awareness. It is knowing exactly what you feel, why you feel it, and what it might push you to do. Emotional leakage is external discharge. It is an unfiltered expression without context, timing, or containment. One builds self-command. The other hands control whoever is paying attention. The mistake most people make is assuming that if something is true internally, it must be expressed externally. That assumption is what collapses authority. Human beings do not respond to emotional exposure with equal vulnerability. They respond with interpretation. Consciously or unconsciously, they ask, "What does this give me?" Advice becomes judgment. Empathy becomes positioning. Curiosity becomes leverage. Even well-meaning people cannot help but recalibrate how they see you once your emotional state is visible. You move from being a stable presence to being a readable one. And readable people are always placed lower in the hierarchy than unreadable ones. This is why people who expose emotions early lose authority instantly. Not because emotions are weak, but because exposure signals a lack of internal control. Authority, at its core, is the perception of stability. When your emotional state is immediately visible, it suggests volatility. It suggests movement. And movement is power given away. The one who reacts is always responding to something outside themselves. The one who contains decides if and when to move. Pay attention to how this plays out everywhere. In leadership, the leader who vents loses gravity. In relationships, the person who reveals attachment too quickly loses leverage. In negotiations, the one who shows urgency loses position. In conflict, the one who explodes loses control of the frame. None of this is moral. None of it is cruel. It is simply how human nervous systems read one another. We are wired to follow what feels solid and to test what feels exposed. Emotional exposure transfers control because it shifts the center of gravity outward. Once your internal state is accessible, others no longer have to wonder how you're affected. They know. That knowledge changes how they behave around you. Some become cautious. Some become manipulative. Some become dismissive. Some become controlling. But none remain neutral. Neutrality disappears the moment your emotions are on display. This is why the idea that being open builds respect collapses under pressure. Respect does not come from being understood. It comes from being unshakable. People respect what does not move easily. They respect what cannot be rushed, guilted, provoked, or emotionally steered. Emotional exposure does the opposite. It shows exactly where pressure works. The danger is not that people will hurt you. The danger is that they will adjust to you. Once someone knows how to move you emotionally, they no longer meet you as an equal. They manage you. They anticipate you. They decide how much truth, effort, or respect you deserve based on how contained you appear. And most people never realize this shift has happened. They only feel the result. Conversations change, tone shifts, boundaries soften, testing increases. This is where identity activation begins. The shift is not from being emotional to being cold. It is from being emotionally expressive to being emotionally contained. Containment does not mean denial. It does not mean suppression. It means your inner world is no longer public property. Your emotions exist, but they do not leak. They inform you, not others. When you stop exposing your internal state reflexively, something subtle but profound happens. Interactions slow down. People listen more carefully. Tests are reduced. Manipulation loses traction. Respect begins to form, not because you demanded it, not because you explained yourself, but because your emotional center is no longer available for negotiation. This is the law everything else in this video builds on. Power collapses the moment your internal state becomes accessible. From here forward, the question is no longer what do I feel? It becomes who has access to that information and why? And that single question is where power begins. Before we go deeper into why emotional exposure becomes leverage, tap like and hit subscribe, because what comes next reveals the real difference between emotional truth and emotional leakage. And human beings like to believe they evaluate one another rationally. That respect is earned through logic, fairness, or moral behavior. But long before the conscious mind forms an opinion, the nervous system has already made a decision. And one of the fastest signals it uses to rank people is emotional control, not emotional repression. Control. Every interaction silently asks one question: who is carrying themselves, and who is being carried by the moment? The answer determines hierarchy instantly. This is why emotional exposure rearranges dominance without a single word being spoken. When one person reveals their emotional state clearly and early, and the other remains contained, the roles are assigned automatically. One becomes readable. The other becomes the reference point. And the readable one is always placed lower. Not out of cruelty, but out of instinct. Emotional visibility and emotional stability are not the same thing. Visibility means others can see what you feel. Stability means others sense that your internal state is not easily moved. The human mind does not respect visibility. It respects stability. Stability signals safety, authority, and self-command. Visibility signals movement, reactivity, and influenceability. Even when people like emotionally visible individuals, they do not defer to them. They advise them. They manage them. They feel entitled to guide, correct, or reshape them. Notice how quickly this happens. Someone shares frustration. Immediately they receive advice. Someone expresses fear. Others reposition themselves as protectors or decision-makers. Someone reveals uncertainty. People step into the role of evaluator. None of this requires bad intent. It happens automatically. Emotional exposure invites response, and response creates hierarchy. This is why the emotionally exposed person almost always ends up in the lower position. Not because they are weak, but because they have shown where pressure works. Once pressure points are visible, the interaction is no longer equal. The contained individual does not need to dominate. The structure does it for them. Think about who people instinctively respect. It is rarely the most expressive person in the room. It is the one whose internal state feels settled. the one who does not rush to clarify how they feel, the one who absorbs information without leaking reaction. That person feels heavier, more grounded, less movable, and weight creates gravity. When emotions are readable, respect erodes quietly. People begin to anticipate you instead of listening to you. They decide how much seriousness to grant you based on how affected you appear. Your words carry less weight because your state carries more information than your content. This is why two people can say the same sentence and receive completely different reactions. One is emotionally visible. The other is emotionally stable. The hierarchy is decided before the sentence finishes. Emotional exposure also invites interpretation. Once people see your internal state, they feel entitled to assign meaning to it. Advice enters, judgment follows, sympathy appears, which feels supportive but subtly lowers status. Manipulation becomes possible because leverage is now available. Even dismissal creeps in because emotionally readable people are easier to categorize and therefore easier to reduce. This is the uncomfortable truth. People respect what they cannot immediately place. When your emotions are exposed, you are placed. When they are contained, you remain undefined. And undefined presence always ranks higher than defined vulnerability. The mistake many people make is assuming that respect grows through emotional sharing. In reality, emotional sharing often accelerates hierarchy, just not in your favor. Respect grows through consistency, restraint, and internal regulation. People need to feel that your emotional state belongs to you, not to the room. This does not mean emotions are dangerous. It means timing is everything. Emotional intensity felt internally does not require emotional discharge externally. The strongest individuals feel deeply, but they do not leak. They tolerate intensity without handing it off. That tolerance alone signals dominance. This is where the affirmation becomes practical, not motivational. Learn to feel without releasing. Learn to hold without broadcasting. Learn to experience emotion without converting it into expression. At first, this feels uncomfortable. The nervous system wants relief. It wants regulation through expression. But once you stop outsourcing regulation to others, something shifts. You become the stabilizing force instead of the stabilized one. People sense it immediately. Hierarchy forms not because you demanded it, but because your internal world stopped being accessible. And this law governs every interaction, whether you acknowledge it or not. The person who reveals more emotionally is placed beneath the one who doesn't. From here forward, power is no longer about what you say or show. It is about what remains unavailable. Manipulation does not begin with words. It begins with information. And the most valuable information a manipulator can ever obtain is not your schedule, your resources, or your position. It is your emotional landscape. Before a manipulator ever makes a move, they are watching, listening, testing, not to understand you, but to map you. This is why manipulators seek emotional information before acting. They are not interested in the truth. They are interested in leverage. Every emotion you reveal answers a question for them. What moves this person? What destabilizes them? What motivates them? What makes them hesitate? Once those answers are collected, strategy becomes easy. Control stops being forceful and becomes subtle. Exposed emotions function as behavioral shortcuts. Instead of persuading you logically, a manipulator can bypass reasoning entirely and go straight to the trigger. Fear short-circuits caution. Guilt overrides boundaries. Urgency collapses patience. Sympathy dissolves resistance. None of these tools require intelligence. They only require access. And emotional exposure grants that access freely. This is why emotionally exposed people become predictable. Not because they are simple, but because their reactions are consistent. When someone knows that guilt makes you comply, they will use guilt. When they know urgency makes you rush, they will create pressure. When they know fear makes you retreat, they will threaten subtly. Predictability is not about personality. It is about emotional response patterns. Once those patterns are visible, control becomes mechanical. Guilt is one of the most effective tools because it disguises manipulation as morality. When your emotions are exposed, manipulators frame requests as obligations. After everything I've done for you. Sympathy becomes leverage when your compassion is visible. I'm really struggling right now. Urgency becomes a weapon when your anxiety is readable. I need an answer now. None of these work unless emotional data has already been revealed. This is why manipulators rarely target emotionally contained individuals, not because they are stronger, but because they are opaque. There is nothing to hook into, no obvious trigger to pull, no predictable collapse point. Manipulation requires a feedback loop. Emotional exposure completes that loop. Containment breaks it. If this is shifting how you see power, containment, and who gets access, tap like and hit subscribe. Your support matters because it helps this message reach people who are ready to stop broadcasting their inner world and start choosing disclosure with precision. And here is the distinction most people never learn. Emotional awareness is not emotional disclosure. Awareness is internal. Disclosure is external. Awareness gives you information about yourself. Disclosure gives information about you to others. One creates power. The other creates vulnerability. Most people confuse the two and assume that if they are aware of what they feel, they must also express it. That assumption is what turns emotions into tools for others. Emotionally intelligent people feel everything, but they disclose selectively. They know that just because an emotion is present does not mean it needs to be shared. They allow emotion to inform their decisions without allowing it to define the interaction. This is not coldness. This is strategy. Once emotional exposure ends, manipulation becomes expensive. Manipulators are forced to escalate, reveal intent, or withdraw. Without emotional data, they lose precision. Without precision, they lose confidence. Without confidence, they lose control. This is why emotionally opaque individuals are often labeled as hard to read, intimidating, or distant. Those labels are defenses. They signal loss of access. The identity transition here is subtle but permanent. You move from being emotionally readable to strategically opaque. You still feel, you still care, but your inner state is no longer a public interface. You stop reacting in ways that educate others on how to move you. You stop narrating your internal world for people who have not earned that access. At first, this shift feels uncomfortable. Silence replaces explanation. Containment replaces release. The nervous system resists because it has been trained to regulate through expression. But once regulation becomes internal, something changes. You stop being managed emotionally by others. Interactions slow. Pressure loses effectiveness. Manipulation reveals itself quickly because it has nowhere to hide. This is not about becoming paranoid or guarded. It is about understanding reality. Emotional exposure is not neutral. It is currency. And currency always changes hands. The moment you realize this, you stop spending it carelessly. This law governs every power dynamic, whether spoken or unspoken. Emotional information is the raw material of control. From this point forward, power is no longer about suppressing emotion. It is about deciding who gets access to it and when. Most people misunderstand restraint because they confuse it with suppression. Suppression is denial. It is pushing emotion down, pretending it does not exist, forcing calm through tension. Containment is the opposite. Containment is awareness without leakage. It is feeling everything fully while choosing not to discharge it outward. One creates internal pressure. The other creates internal stability. And stability is what power actually looks like in real human interaction. This is why emotionally contained people feel heavy when they enter a room. Not dramatic, not intimidating, heavy. Their presence does not rush outward, it settles inward. There is no emotional spill, no urgency to be understood, no need to regulate themselves through others. That weight is not confidence theater. It is nervous system control. And every nervous system in the room senses it instantly. Human beings are wired to orient around stability. When one person remains calm, while others fluctuate, the calm one becomes the reference point. Conversations unconsciously adjust, voices soften, interruptions decrease, aggression hesitates. This does not happen because the contained person demands respect. It happens because their internal regulation forces external regulation in others. Silence plays a crucial role here, but not as avoidance. Silence, when paired with calm, creates a psychological vacuum. Most people are uncomfortable with unresolved emotional space. When they speak and receive no immediate emotional feedback, their nervous system looks for balance. They begin explaining themselves, softening their tone, adjusting their posture. They self-correct without being told to. This is power without confrontation. Notice what is missing in these interactions: escalation. There is no argument to win, no boundary to defend verbally, no dominance display. Emotional containment does not push back, it absorbs. And absorption is far more destabilizing than resistance. Resistance gives people something to fight. Containment gives them nothing to grip. This is why boundaries stop being tested when emotional exposure ends. Testing relies on feedback. A push is meaningless if it produces no reaction. Once people realize they cannot provoke, rush, guilt, or emotionally steer you, testing becomes pointless. They stop because there is no reward. Not because you threatened them. Not because you explained yourself. Because access was quietly removed. Emotional containment establishes dominance without aggression because it shifts where control lives. Control no longer lives in the interaction. It lives in you. You are no longer managing others' behavior. You are managing your internal state. And that alone reshapes the hierarchy. People sense that they cannot move you emotionally, and they adjust accordingly. This is where many misunderstand power. They believe power must be expressed outwardly, asserted, defended, announced. In reality, the most durable power is invisible. It is the kind that changes behavior before conflict ever arises. Emotional containment does exactly that. It prevents challenges instead of responding to them. Internal regulation is the integration point. When you regulate internally, you stop outsourcing stability to explanation, validation, or emotional release. You no longer need others to reassure you, agree with you, or understand you in order to remain grounded. That independence is felt immediately. It signals self-command. And self-command is what others instinctively defer to. This does not mean you become distant or disconnected. It means your emotions stop being public instruments. You still feel empathy, anger, disappointment, excitement. But those emotions do not leak into the interaction unless you decide they should. Expression becomes a tool, not a reflex. Silence becomes a choice, not a shutdown. At first, this level of containment feels uncomfortable because it removes familiar coping mechanisms. No venting, no emotional signaling, no immediate relief through expression. But as the nervous system adapts, something powerful emerges: steadiness. You stop needing the room to regulate you. The room begins to regulate around you. This is the transformation. Power without force, authority without noise, boundaries without confrontation, respect without demand. And it all rests on this law. What is contained cannot be used against you. Once your emotional world is no longer accessible, leverage disappears, manipulation fails, pressure weakens, hierarchy stabilizes in your favor, not because you fought for it, but because nothing in you was available to be used. From here forward, power is no longer something you assert. It is something others sense and adjust to automatically. The final shift is not behavioral. It is identity-based. Until now, emotional restraint may have felt like something you do. From this point forward, it becomes something you are. The transformation is subtle but permanent. You move from expressing emotions to commanding them, not suppressing, not denying, commanding. This is the moment emotional power locks in. Most people live from expression. They feel something and instinctively externalize it through tone, posture, explanation, reaction, or urgency. Their internal state constantly leaks into the environment, teaching others how to treat them. Emotionally powerful individuals reverse this flow. Their inner world does not spill outward. It informs decisions internally, but it does not announce itself. Expression becomes optional. Exposure becomes deliberate. This is the psychological shift from expression to command. When you command your emotional state, you stop being shaped by the moment. You no longer react to provoke relief or validation. You decide whether an emotion deserves movement or containment. That decision alone separates leaders from followers, authorities from participants, respected figures from managed ones. Let's recap the laws that brought you here. Emotional exposure collapses power because it transfers control outward. Emotional visibility creates hierarchy because the readable is always ranked below the stable. Emotional information becomes raw material for manipulation when it is freely available. Containment creates power without conflict because it removes leverage without resistance. And now, emotional inaccessibility becomes the identity that holds all of this together. Emotionally powerful people are immediately recognizable, not by what they say, but by how they move. They walk without hurry. They pause without apology. They listen without needing to respond immediately. Their posture is settled. Their tone is measured. Their decisions are unpressured. Nothing about them signals urgency, desperation, or emotional need. This is not performance. It is regulation. When emotionally inaccessible individuals enter a space, they do not scan for approval. They do not seek resonance. They do not rush to clarify themselves. Their nervous system is already anchored. That anchoring forces others to adjust. Conversations are slow. Interruptions decrease. Manipulation attempts soften or vanish. Respect begins to form, quietly, automatically. One of the most important distinctions here is this: emotional inaccessibility is not emotional absence. These individuals feel deeply. They experience anger, empathy, disappointment, and desire. But those emotions do not dictate behavior in real time. They are processed internally first. Expression happens only when it serves a purpose. This is when emotional exposure becomes deliberate instead of reflexive. Deliberate exposure is powerful because it is rare and controlled. When an emotionally inaccessible person chooses to reveal something, it carries weight. People pay attention because they know it was not impulsive. It was chosen. That choice reframes vulnerability from weakness into authority. The difference is not what is shared. It is who controls the timing. This is why emotionally inaccessible people are respected, not feared. Fear comes from unpredictability and aggression. Emotional inaccessibility creates predictability of a different kind. Stability. Others know you cannot be rushed, guilted, or emotionally hijacked. That makes interaction safer, not more dangerous. People trust what does not fluctuate wildly. Manipulators sense this immediately. They either withdraw, adjust their behavior, or expose themselves through escalation. Emotional tactics stop working. Pressure loses force. The interaction equalizes or tilts in your favor, without a single confrontation. At this stage, silence becomes your default authority. Speech becomes a tool, not a reflex. You do not explain unless explanation strengthens your position. You do not react unless a reaction is chosen. You do not reveal unless revelation serves alignment. This is not detachment from humanity. It is mastery of self. The dark psychology protocol locks here because this identity does not require maintenance. You do not need to remind yourself to stay calm. Calmness becomes structural. You do not need to protect boundaries verbally. Boundaries are enforced by inaccessibility. You do not need to assert dominance. Dominance emerges through non-movement. This is the highest emotional position available in human dynamics, and it rests on one final law. The strongest position is being unreachable emotionally. Unreachable does not mean cold. Unreachable does not mean cruel. Unreachable means your internal world is not open for negotiation. From this position, power is no longer something you chase. It is something others adapt to. And once you arrive here, there is no need to explain it, because those who recognize it already understand. If this protocol showed you why the strongest position is being unreachable emotionally, tap like and hit subscribe and comment this below. What is contained cannot be used against me. Because once emotional access ends, leverage disappears, and power returns to your control.